Hey, hello and welcome. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll be talking about Apache Oozie, which in particular has had some exciting new developments recently. And we want to talk also about how it works with Apache Ambari, and in particular, a very neat set of parts of Ambari. So with that, we'll start off and walk you through some of these new developments and some of the very cool bits in Ambari, and then we'll motivate it with a use case. So hopefully if you guys have any interest in HBase or connecting Oozie up to some of the more interesting parts of the Hadoop ecosystem that require a little bit of tuning, we'll also walk through that. With that, I want to introduce us. We've got Artem Ervitz. He's a solutions engineer with Hortonworks. Myself, Clay Benziger. I'm an architect for our Hadoop infrastructure group at Bloomberg. So I want to start off with a poll for you guys in the audience. And I want to ask, who here has used or does use Oozie? If you just raise your hands. Awesome. Keep them up for a second. How many of you have used it with Kerberos on a secure Hadoop cluster? That's awesome. Very cool to see. OK, next question. I want to know how many of you have used Hue, the Hadoop user experience with Oozie? Cool. And then how many workflows do you have in production? Are you using it in production? And if so, are you between 1 and 10 workflows? OK, cool. How many folks have 10 to 50? Or I guess 11 to 50? Cool. And how many people have more than 50? Very cool. We got a nice even spread. Now the next question, and this gets really interesting with Oozie, is how many actions in those workflows? Your most complex, craziest workflow, either the one you've written or one of your tenants on your infrastructure's written, how many actions does it have? Java actions, et cetera. Would you say 1 to 10? Very cool. How about 11 to 50? Very cool. And does anyone feel that they're doing a graph analytic problem when they work on their workflow and it's more than 50 actions? Very cool. And then another one, we want to know what you use Oozie with. So in particular, HBase, any Oozie users who integrate it with HBase? Cool. And how many folks use Spark with Oozie? Very cool. Python. Ah, nice. And now, let me just clarify, Python without PySpark in particular. OK, cool. And then deployment automation. Anyone have any crazy ways that they actually deploy code with Oozie? OK, cool. The last answer to that was no one except for somebody on my team, so I just wanted to double check. Do you like XML? I mean, how many of you you go home at night and you study the XML specification? Oh, well, Artem, good, good. That said, since everyone therefore probably hates XML, do you have a favorite editor for your Oozie workflows? Like, have you at least come to terms with it, or is it just a pain? Well, it sounds like you're in the right talk. So,
does anyone not like Oozie?
Oh, that's a good point. Some people really dislike Oozie, unfortunately.
And
okay, cool.
We're hoping to convince you otherwise today. So
we're not Oozie committers. We're actually Oozie users. So we try to convince. We've got Oozie committers in the audience. So try to convince, motivate new ways for Oozie to be better for all of us. So with that, I want to hand off to Artem for some of the competitors to Oozie that are out there.
So I don't like to say competitors, but it's fine, right? So the landscape is now pretty vibrant. We have Oozie for a long time now, since 2011, 2010. There's Azkaban from LinkedIn, right? It's getting a lot of attention as well. Luigi from Spotify. I'm in New York, so Spotify community is pretty big in New York, so they do a lot of meetups there. It's getting a lot of attention there. And then there's Apache Airflow, which is really getting a lot of attention now. And distinction between all of these, I would say Airflow and Luigi, they're API driven, right? So claim to fame would be if you're a developer, right? You can write code. Your workflow says code. So and then you can unit test them, you can div them. So that's a big plus. We're going to talk about Oozie today, right? How we can work with Oozie better, as well as what can we do to show comparison with these other tools.
So with that.
So let's talk about introduction to Oozie, right? So I see that there's about 50% audience that is familiar with Oozie, right? It's a pretty mature project, came out of Yahoo. So it's a workflow scheduler. It works on DAGs, direct acyclical graphs. There are coordinators, there are workflows, there are bundles. So it's a it has a nice structure to it, right? So some people actually think it's complex, and I'm hoping to show you today that it's really not that complex once you see it in a visual way. It's integrated very well with Hadoop, right? So if you're at this conference, most likely you're here for Hadoop. Right, the other tools I talked about shortly, their claim to fame is also not just Hadoop, but other things, right? But to Clay's point, right, if you're talking about HA, enterprise, and security, right, Oozie is probably the best game in town in that sense, right? And it's really scalable. If you talk about the scale, right, I will reference a book on Oozie where an employee of Yahoo was talking about running millions of jobs a day with Oozie, right? Workflows with thousands of actions in one workflow. So that's a crazy scale. And I'll point you to the book so you can probably Google what the scale is there.
And the key thing, is it's definitely easy to get started with all of these built-in actions. It really helps out being able to just grab any of those.
Right.
And
out of the box,
yep,
give me a second. Yeah. So out of the box, there's a Spark action, there's a MapReduce, Hive, Pig, HDFS action, Shell, and then there's other ones, right? Fork join. These are very cool things there to make your flows more condition-like. So the release timeline, right? It was released in 2010. Yahoo hosted it on a GitHub repo, right? But is any mature ecosystem project you'd like to be in an Apache so you could get community participation? So they decided to release it in Apache. I think in 2.x it was still in GitHub, right? By then we already had workflows. With 3.0 we introduced coordinators. And then in 4.x, we introduced bundles, right? And anybody familiar with bundles? Okay. Coordinators. Wow. So coordinators, so workflow is you define an action and what do you want to do with it, right? But to make it time-based, you will introduce a concept called coordinator, right? I want to run this at a certain time or between certain period of time. So that's where Oozie actually becomes usable. Otherwise, I don't even see a reason to define it in a workflow, right? They start being useful when they're as part of coordinator. Now, when Yahoo introduced bundles into the project, that's when it became really useful because now you can chain multiple coordinators together and have some really diverse workflows in that sense. So yeah, with the introduction of the latest release, 4.x is the latest stable release. One word with the release of 5x branch, 4.x is becoming a maintenance release. I'm sorry, Andres, if I mention it, but I think I have to. We're still going to continue running 4.x release in HDP for at least this year. So, a lot of this still applies. But the introduction of Hive H catalog, Spark integration, SLAs. One unknown fact about Oozie would be that it does support SLA notifications, right? So my job is running too slow, right? My job is late by this much. You can set those SLA expectations there. And Workflow Manager that we'll be talking about actually supports all of those concepts in that sense. 5.0. So yesterday was an Apache blog post on release of 5.0. It was released a week ago. Huge change from the previous releases, right? So there was a tweet a couple of weeks ago still referencing all the gaps in Oozie, saying, it's slow, it's hard to use. I think we addressed most of those complaints in this release, right? And I'll talk about in detail what those features are there. Hadoop 1 is removed in 5x, right? So if you're running HDP 1.3, I'm sorry for you. And support for Hadoop 3 and Yarn application master support, so I'll talk about that. That's a really important feature. You'll really like it. So yeah, with that I can talk about that tweet that went out, right? So Oozie has a lot of misconceptions about it that are in a community, right? So it's hard to use, it's XML driven, there's no Fluent API, complex structure, right? Bundles, coordinators, you know. So the very first complaint is that Oozie jobs are executed on Hadoop as mapper jobs, right? So map reduce jobs. So when you submit a job, it will be a mapper launcher. All right? There's a very dated UI that comes with Oozie, right? Confusing object model, as I mentioned already. Complicated setup. You got to deal with XML. DAG visualizations, they're also dated. There's no SLAs. That's a common misconception. There's no fine-grained authorization, and there's no easy way to debug things when they go break. And they break a lot, right? So I'm a long-term user of Oozie, and I want to, you know, destroy my laptop sometimes. But I am passionate about this project because a lot of those misconceptions can go, you can work around them. So firstly, so in 5.0, the launcher, the map tasks were replaced with Yarn application. So what does that give you? First of all, there's no extra map task, right? We can deprecate map reduce in that sense. It runs as a Yarn container, which means your jobs don't suffer from the job startup costs. Your jobs will finish a lot faster, right? So when I just ran my, ran my examples on a 5.0 release, I was like, wow, I can't believe it's finished because it takes so much more, so much less. So at least 40, 45 seconds I was gaining just by using that 5x release, right? On any simple, like if you run a shell action, a Python action, they'll be so much faster just because they switched to the new UI, new
launcher.
Launcher, yes, sorry. Dated UI, so with that Jira, 5x, we replaced well, sorry.
Upcoming.
That's a future release. We're not going to comment when it's going to be coming out, but you know, everybody knows there's a dated UI. There's a there's a license incompatibility there as well, so we can't really continue shipping with that license. So we're planning to, well, I'm part of the community. I'm not a committer. I just tag along. So the community is planning to replace the EXT.js UI that's been there for the longest time with something new, sexy, you know, and makes it look possible. In the meantime, you could use Hue or Workflow Manager, and it's not as painful then. So confusing object model, first things first, I would argue that it's really not that confusing. If you're from a drag and drop world, this is not an issue, you know, and I'll show you in the Workflow Manager that it's very easy to understand. I didn't even know about bundles. I've never worked with bundles until I tried Workflow Manager, and I was like, what's the big deal here? It's very simple. Now, there is work going on to introduce Jobs API, Fluent API, where you can actually build your workflows with code, right? So Java will be first, but then Python, Jython, whatever else community decides that is critical, that's going to be introduced. There is a patch already out, but more community feedback is necessary so that we can take this and make it much cooler. So complicated setup, yes. I mean, this was built a while, so the work is in progress on that. But Jetty was replaced, Tomcat was replaced with Jetty, so it makes it a little bit easier there. Again, with XML, there's a Fluent API if you're a developer, and if you're a drag and drop, you know, ETL kind of guy, gal, you could use Workflow Manager and Hue. DAG visualizations, there was a Jung library that was replaced with GraphViz, makes it a lot more, it looks a lot nicer. So it's a visual thing, it's really not, I think it's more scalable too this time around. I have a slide on that. SLA alerting, been there since 4.x. We don't have to talk about it. We can catch me offline if you're interested in that feature.
And that Jira is actually the email SLA alerting. There's a number of ways to get SLA alerting from Oozie.
Correct. So there's email SLAs, and then there's JMS. If you have like a standby active MQ cluster, you could push it there. And since this is an Apache project, you can extend it to other things besides Apache MQ. And easy access to log files was also addressed with that Jira, so it's easier to debug now these things. All right, so this is probably the most exciting feature I'm happy to see, right? So if you can see, application type is MapReduce. So in 5.x, it was replaced with a Yarn application. So it's a native Yarn application. You know, they decided to call it Oozie Launcher, right? So it's a lot more efficient, a lot more lightweight, I'd say. It's great. This is a screenshot of a 5.x Oozie.
This feature it makes all of us in the Oozie using community, I think, happy enough that the feature was oh yeah, or OYA.
Oh yeah. Oozie on Yarn, oh yeah. But you know, from the blog post I saw yesterday, that was actually started as a hackathon. So you know, kudos to the development team there. One thing I'm very excited to see is this ugly theme in Oozie is gone away. We got, you know, a guy from Maven community just came in and he said, I'm a developer in the Maven community. I can't even fathom, I can't have ugly docs. And when I saw the new docs, I was like, oh my God, that looks so much nicer. So the junk was replaced with GraphViz, right? This is probably a bad screenshot to represent what it looks like, but it makes it pop. There's a lot more nodes you can represent on the graph. I think Oozie would even crash before if we had to hard code nodes to like 25 only. So it wouldn't even display before. So that was replaced. Jobs API, right? So can everybody see this? If you refer to the Jira, you can actually see more about it. Basically, makes coding your workflows much easier. You don't have to deal with XML, right? You can unit test these very easily. And when Andras walked me through how, you know, what else is possible, it's pretty slick. You know, you can copy paste nodes and then build new nodes out of the old ones. A lot of things is implied, so you don't even have to, like, fork join, I believe, is implied, so you don't even have to think about those things, right? So it's a Fluent builder API. It's awesome, right? So I'm rooting for it to land in the next release. And it might be good to mention that Oozie is now going to the rapid release cycle. So we should see new releases every few months.
So with that, I want to talk about how to make things a little easier. And Apache Ambari was started off as a project to do just that. Designing to, originally, how do you actually set up a Hadoop cluster, provision it, be able to install all the components? How do you operate all the components? For anyone who's ever managed a Hadoop system, you definitely understand that your HDFS takes some care in feeding, that configuring your Yarn class paths and such takes some care in feeding. And all of this is integrated in the Apache Ambari project, and it's a fantastic start to the Apache Ambari project. Something that came in relatively recently is now the monitoring of Hadoop clusters. And there was a great talk presented yesterday on the metric system in Apache Ambari, for example. And so it actually uses HBase, and it's able to be very nice and scalable for getting all the metrics you have in your cluster in a central point with a good dashboard. Furthermore, it has an alerting framework. Those metrics sometimes might tell you that things are going bad, and now it can actually tell you that. But the key part, especially as an Oozie user, is that it has this dashboarding system. And these dashboards are called Ambari Views. And Ambari Views are quite awesome. There's a number of them. But basically, it's quoting the Ambari developers webpage here. It's a systematic way to plug in UI capabilities. And with that, one of the key things is that you don't need an Ambari managed cluster. We at Bloomberg don't use Ambari. But we do still are able to take advantage of these Ambari Views. As a third party, if you're an independent software vendor writing stuff for Hadoop, you can actually make your own views. So you can plug them into Ambari, and anyone using Ambari to manage their systems, able to just launch off and get a nice view into your software. Similarly, there are the major views that come with Ambari today. There's a Yarn capacity scheduler view, so you can kind of configure your queues and understand your capacities. There's an HDFS files view, so you can actually see your HDFS and even interact with it, upload, download files. It even supports S3. There's a Hawk view for Apache Hawk incubating. There's an Apache Hive view as well, Apache Pig view, Apache Storm view, Apache Tez. The Tez one in particular, very useful for being able to actually debug your Tez jobs, understand if they're running slow or not. Then similarly, and the main point today, there's the Oozie Workflow Manager. And there's definitely alternatives to these. The Hadoop user experience Hue has been around for longer than Apache Ambari and offers a number of these features for views. And then there's many bespoke applications, ranging from like Dr. Elephant and Hannibal and things like that for debugging your jobs in HBase. But Ambari brings this all in one nice place. And so with that, we want to talk about kind of the motivation here. Certainly Artem's explained quite a bit about XML it's difficult to work with in Oozie. And one of the big challenges here is how do we actually provide visibility into those workflows? And so the Ambari team actually provides a GUI that is able to let you drag and drop and build a workflow. So here on the right-hand side, we can see a workflow that starts, it has a fork, has 2 different actions, and it ends. And then we can see on the left-hand side how it's actually defined in XML. Similarly, one of the nice things about this is it has an interface. So if you've ever dealt with a parameterized workflow where you have a job.properties that you need to submit with it and make sure that you configure everything, when you click on these actions, you can configure all of those properties. So it really lessens human error. The other really nice thing is that it actually has a browser with that file view so that you can upload your workflows. You can write them on your desktop using an IDE, NetBeans, Eclipse, or what have you with a really nice XML editor, and you can just drop it into your web browser and away you go. The other key part, it has S3 support, so those of you running on the cloud can take advantage of this nicely. But it also replaces the existing Oozie UI that has that limitation of 25 activities in, actions in Oozie 4.x. And so it's a really nice view into Oozie independent of the Oozie web UI. Similarly, it doesn't have that limitation. It's been tested with over 300 actions in a workflow, so you don't have to worry if you do have a complex workflow that it's going to crash on you. And just like Oozie being so scalable, it can scale to the 1 million jobs a day, and it can be quite extensible. The Workflow Manager, you can run multiple instances. So if you are a large enterprise and you need to scale up multiple Ambari Views servers, it's perfectly possible to do that. So with that, to kind of walk through a little bit more on the UI interface one sees, there are 2 main views. You've got your workflow editor, and then you've got a view in to see how those workflows run. In the workflow editor, it's part of the Ambari view. When you go with your web browser to the Ambari view, you can launch this. You log in as yourself, so it is multi-tenant. If you run a secure cluster, you don't have to worry about everyone submitting their Oozie job as the Ambari user. It enables basically the visualization, and this is what Artem was mentioning with bundles. If you need to try to visualize what your workflows are doing, this is a really useful tool. It also helps out with being able to just get views up there, workflows up there on your cluster. A lot of folks operate clusters where it's maybe in a data center in a different administrative domain than a corporate desktop. This allows you, if you're able to have web reachability and that's okay with your firewall folks, you can actually now upload those workflows right from a developer desktop. And then again, the user input issue is really solved this way. So you don't kick off a workflow, potentially wait for a number of actions to run through, and then realize, oh, I didn't have that quite set to what I thought I did. You can actually visualize it in the UI. And it's just minimal input. It's able to do this very easily. Now, the execution view, once you've written your workflow and you kick it off, it's running on the Oozie server, you want to see how it actually is running. You've got this execution view that gives you a nice dashboard. You're able to actually view all of your Oozie jobs. And one of the key things, certainly made better in Oozie 5, but for all of us still on Oozie 4, you can drill down through your logs. So you can actually understand, hey, why did my launcher fail? What's going on here? So with that.
All right. So again, right, so this is a scalable solution, right? It keeps the state in the local Ambari database, right? If you're an admin, you're probably worried, right? I don't want to have give access to all of my ETL guys to, develop these workflows, right? So you could, because it inherits from Ambari, it has the persona-based access controls, right? So you can define view-only type of roles, right? And give those views to those non-admin users, right? And so you can stand these up, right? So like Bloomberg is using Chef, I'm using Ansible to stand up my instances, right? You can automate these very easily. It's a couple of REST API calls and you can stand these up. You have a database on your machine where you deploy it, all of the stuff you do in the intermediate steps will be saved there. What this also does, and I'll show it to you, that you can save, let's say you have a very complex workflow where an action has a lot of variables that you need to save, right? Let's say key tabs or something like that. You don't want to re-enter this all the time. Or let's say admin gives you, admin will want to delegate something to you that they don't want you to mess it up, right? Introduce an error. So you can save these, export this to HDFS or to your local database and reuse these once in a while. It's a really powerful feature if you want to.
We're running short on time, so
Yes,
let's skip the UI walkthrough.
Sure.
You guys will be able to see this on the slides, though, to really appreciate what we've got. And I want to just motivate through with some Workflow Manager examples with HBase. HBase is a somewhat difficult component to integrate with Oozie because you've got delegation tokens if you're running in a secure cluster, and it doesn't have a native action today. So with that, there's a couple things that often a typical Ambari managed cluster you might need to set up, or if you're, as my team does, setting up your own Oozie instance, you've got to set up so you can actually talk to HBase, and the HBase server can get you those delegation tokens you need, as well as in your workflow.xmls, you've got some specific data you have to enter. Then kind of one of the motivations here for us at least is how do we deploy our HBase tables and set up ACLs? And one of the things is we want that to be repeatable. We don't want to have one cluster with one table and then, oops, misspelled on the other, or that ACL wasn't quite consistent, so what's going on? So we want to make sure that it's consistent. So I'm going to show kind of a way that that can be done and motivate in just a couple lines of code. And then with compactions, if you've ever had to do care and feeding of an HBase, you know that you have to compact your data regularly, and you usually want to be somewhat aware of how that's working. Thanks to a new feature in HBase, it plugs really nicely into Oozie, and we'll talk about that. So with the setup of an Oozie server for being able to talk to HBase, sorry, you guys can yell at me when I keep walking in front of the slides. The Oozie server needs some various bits here. In your libexec directory, basically where the Oozie server gets all of its libraries, you have to dump a bunch of jars in from the HBase project. They're just listed here. The slides will be online, but you've got to set those up. And then in the case of a current existing Oozie, you've got to rebuild your war. There's a nice little shell script for that. And then in Oozie site.xml, you also need to just make sure that you have the HBase credentials added to the classes of credentials that it can get. And once you've got that, now you've got an Oozie server that's able to talk to HBase. It's got those libraries, and it's able to understand that it needs to get you a delegation token if you're on a secure cluster. With that, then in your workflow, you need to specify that, hey, I'm going to need some HBase credentials. And with that, you can, in your workflow.xml, if you've never used Oozie on a secure cluster, it's really easy. And this is one of the big differentiators for my team, certainly, where we operate only secure clusters, is that security management in Oozie is really simple. You can say, hey, look, I'm accessing web H catalog, or I'm accessing HBase, and I need these credentials. And here we see kind of the pattern for that. You've got a credentials tag in XML, and then a credential tag for this particular credential. And then you just set your normal security settings, such as what the Zookeeper quorum is, that it is Kerberos and not some other custom class. Everything you would have in a normal HBase site for a client. And with that, you're good to go. And now you can actually run a workflow against HBase. So just to kind of step back, that's how you'd have it in a secure cluster. You would put your credentials section in your workflow, and then you'd have your action. And here we've got an action that would leverage those credentials, and it uses HBase shell. So if anyone has used HBase shell, it's this nice Ruby API to talk to HBase, maintained by the HBase community, so it's always API compatible with the version you're running. And one of the big questions here is, well, how do I create tables? There's no native HBase action in Oozie today, but I need to create a table. And as we can see here, it's a very short set of Ruby commands. You're able to just say, hey, you know what? I want to double check. Does the table already exist? If so, we're good. If it doesn't exist, I then need to actually create my table. And whatever my specification for that table is, here we have one column.
And it doesn't have to be just Ruby, right? It could be a bash script if you wanted.
Yeah, you could be echoing commands into the HBase shell. You could also similarly do this in Java, which, if you're a native Java programmer, is very simple as well. And Artem will actually have a demo of how to run native HBase talking Java code. And so with that, this shell action could run. You could still set it in a coordinator. You could set it to run every day. If you blow away your HBase cluster and it's a continuous integration cluster, that's great. Your continuous integration job can blow away your tables, and you can still make sure that your workflow actually always deploys exactly what you think your schema is, and exactly what you think your table name is, exactly what you think your ACLs are. Now, I want to talk about the major compaction tool in HBase. This just came about recently. It's a really neat addition from the HBase community, and it lends itself really well to Oozie because it's a super simple tool for doing something that's otherwise really complex in HBase. In HBase, you can ask a table to do a major compaction. It's a bunch of shuffle, a bunch of data movement on HDFS. It's a bunch of data reloading and region servers, which you always want to be really cognizant of the load on in HBase. And this is just a command line tool to do all of that with a throttle so that you don't cause your region servers to run out of space. And so anyone in the HBase community, definitely recommend you look this up. You can run it on, you can build it from a newer version of HBase and run it against an older version. But it's a very useful thing, and what Artem will demonstrate is how it used to be done, even in a much more naive way, which required code. And now it's just a command line. We can kick it off with an Oozie shell action. The same way that Oozie shell example was kicked off, you would just run HBase and the class for the major compactor and the command line arguments. So with that, did you want me to cover this? Okay, so let me leave you guys with some resources before we jump off into the demo. So some key things, the Oozie mailing list is a super useful resource to understand all of these new features, how they work, and if you've got problems that you're like, I'm just not getting the help, and it seems like this is probably a bug in Oozie, great place to ask before you file a JIRA. And then with that, Artem's got a ton of resources. He's got a 12-part series that really walks through in depth the Workflow Manager. So you can really make sure you understand it. You can point your tenants if you're a Hadoop administrator to it. Make sure that you really understand it as well if you're a user. And then he has a very nice set of Oozie examples. These are great examples to get started with. They don't cover a secure cluster, which makes them much simpler to be able to understand and see the power of what you can do with Oozie, and really see that it's only a couple lines of XML, and if you're using it in the Workflow Manager, then it's usually just one action that your workflow would have, and it's only got a couple configuration options. I've got some talks on Oozie that are much more in depth on code deployment with Oozie, trying to get an action for Git into Oozie so that you can actually natively download code with Oozie. And similarly, I've got a presentation on HBase multi-tenancy that we do at Bloomberg with Oozie, a lot more on the compaction and deploying tables and such. So with that, now it's time for a demo. Yep, you run yours, I'll run mine. And
So just to get started, right, there's a nice README that Clay created to create this major compaction example. And the reason we're doing this rather than some Hive action or Pig action is because those are very well documented, right? Doing HBase with Oozie is known, but not everybody would know about this. So especially, with Oozie being, kind of not as active in the recent times, but we're hoping to evangelize this, and that's why I'm saying that you can do other things with Oozie, not just the standard out-of-the-box stuff. So HBase major compaction is one example. Basically, it's just a Java action, right? You write code to compact a table. I have it right there. Yeah. Oh, now we're relying on the internet from Hotel.
So just for reference, that HBase 19528 JIRA that brought in the HBase major compactor replaces all of this code, which does the most naive thing you could possibly do to kick off a compaction. Well, it does it right, and it does it very well. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we're running versus just running a shell command. So
in the Oozie resources section, you can find the links to this code. But there is a README. Yeah, I know, I gotta jump to this. And you can just follow this. It's not really hard to try. Now, on to the Workflow Manager. Let me just find it. So let me do it from scratch, from what I already have prepared, right? I'm going to create a new workflow, right? I'm going to import from a shared file system.
So this could be your HDFS or your S3?
Yes, so this could be, like he said, S3 or HDFS, right? This is something that didn't come out of the box, right? I just grabbed his example, and this talks to the power of Workflow Manager that it will parse the workflows you already have, and they'll validate that they're accurate, right? And there's missing a slash or something like that. This will parse for it. So this reduces the errors you can have with your workflows if you edit them in manually versus something like Workflow Manager, right? So it parsed everything in the workflow, just to show you, wow. So I'm calling the class, the Java class that of that Java program that I showed you. You know, I can introduce other action commands. You know, on error do this, on OK do that. It will grab the credentials that Clay defined for his secure cluster, right? Because my cluster is not secure, I'm just going to uncheck it. But this just talks about the power here. It will parse everything and will know what to do with these, with the arguments in the XML. Other than that, this is pretty much it. Point the HBase site of your existing cluster to this workflow, and you're good to go. Now, for the sake of the demo and 4 minutes that we have, I'm going to run the one that definitely works. And while this executes, so when you submit, he used variables to introduce some of these things. So realm for your Kerberos, so it's a variable. So I just entered blah. I don't really care about it because I'm ignoring HBase credentials. The only thing that I have to pass is the zookeeper quorum and the table name to compact. I'm going to submit. It works, but while this is happening, let me preview the XML. You would have to edit all this manually. So if you love XML, and I saw hundreds of hands come up,
I mean, I just fall asleep at night thinking about XML. You know, XML. Doesn't everyone know? Oh, how strange.
So while this is running, it's not updating on the screen. There you go. Let me show you the power here. Status, running. User, CentOS. So, well, because it finished probably. So the dashboard view is more powerful than the standard Oozie UI because we added some usability features here. We can chain the filters to look for these jobs. We can filter on types, workflows, coordinators, bundles, right? And then when we go into the job, you typically go to drill down into the Yarn application, then the Yarn task, and then, you know, to find the jobs. This feature right here, I said, you can't introduce Workflow Manager for the users if you don't have this feature. So I'm pointing to this with the, I'm going directly to the job, directly to the map task, and because I said capture output, and if you see the Java code, he's printing these statements in the Java code, so I can see that. I know that this worked. All right, so I have 2 minutes. So that I know, are there any questions? Because I can stop now, or I can just show you more of the. Perfect.
So if you're, in our case, we use Chef. It is on github.com, github.com/Bloomberg/Chef hyphen, and our team's called BAC, Bloomberg Automated Clusters for Hadoop. So Chef-BACH is the repository. It is definitely work to stand up an Ambari server, an Ambari Views server. And since we aren't using Ambari to manage the cluster, there's no GUI to configure the endpoints on our cluster. So we end up calling the REST APIs to Ambari. Ambari is 100% REST API driven, much like Oozie, which is actually the Oozie command line is all REST behind the scenes. But in the case of Ambari, when we set it up, we have to actually call all those REST APIs to tell it where the name node lives, where the Oozie URL is, and all of that. And should we reconfigure anything on the server, our Chef code takes care of it for us, but something has to call that REST API and update it. There is documentation on the Ambari project on how to stand up a Views server, but certainly feel free to read our code, or if you try to read our code and can't, which we can't sometimes too, but write us an issue, and we're happy to try to help folks. So
the Ambari Chef Chef recipe, I have the initial version. They made it production ready. As he already mentioned, I'm a solutions engineer, so if it works in a demo, it's good for me. So you can just take this curl command, and it will bring up an instance of Ambari View, right? But you got to install the bits first. So you install the bits, and then you can launch this curl command, and you're good to go. So you don't need a cluster managed by Ambari to run this. Point it to the Oozie URL, a couple of other commands, and then whatever the user that's running Ambari server has to be the proxy user for the workflow manager. So if you read the HDP documentation for the views, it walks through.
You know, you call it a really important feature. So for those of you guys who are running Kerberized clusters like we are, sometimes users just have a really hard time understanding Kerberos. One of the nice things is the Ambari Views can have an LDAP server so that you log in with a username and a password since you're using a web browser. And then you don't have to use Kerberos credentials because the Ambari server is what's actually talking to Oozie on the back end and saying, hey, user cbenzig, in my case, submitted this workflow. It's technically the Ambari server that's saying it, but it still runs as me on the Hadoop cluster. So this makes it a lot easier for users to be able to use a login and password.
And yeah.
So you need to proxy that user
Indeed. So in your core site, for example, you would need to configure your cluster to accept the Ambari user doing that.
That's in the Workflow Manager docs, so you'll see that. If you get the remote API fail, you know that you got to set up the proxy. One thing I want to call out, right? So the same way as it is in Oozie, you know, it was for Oozie 4, there was a limit of 25 action nodes that you can represent on a diagram, right? Here we've tested with many nodes, so this is more
plus.
scalable. It's a lot more lightweight because we're not carrying all of the baggage with Oozie. This is just Ambari Views framework, right? And it's talking the REST API of Oozie to get all that information populated here. So this is really lightweight. You know, some other concepts here, you know, very easy to look at the logs.
Our time's going up
I know,
now.
we
so
know. Any other questions? Oozie 5 will be part of HDP 3 something. I'm trying to push for Oozie 5 to be part of HDP, but we missed the boat. So one Christmas gift I can offer you is the Oozie 4.3.1, which is the latest stable release, will be part of HDP 3, which, you know, we haven't updated Oozie in HDP for years. It was always 4.2. So a lot of cool features that came in the meantime will be there. One feature you won't see is the Oozie launcher, the Java 8 support, so those types of things. But there will be an update, it just won't be a major update. I'm pushing the product management team to push it to 5x in a very early release of 3.x. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.